I was ill for 10 days after my Amish wedding night. No one would call a doctor. On the morning of the second day, I understood that the clock in our house was not the one on the kitchen wall. The clock was my breathing. I lay in the upstairs bedroom of a farmhouse I had entered as a bride less than 40 hours earlier, and I counted the seconds between one shallow breath and the next, because I had already begun to suspect that no one downstairs intended to count them for me. I was 19 years old. My name is Rebecca. The window beside the bed faced east, and the early light came through the curtain in a pale strip across the quilt my mother-in-law had finished only the week before. I remember thinking that the quilt was beautiful, and that I might die under it, and that both of these things could somehow be true at once. I am 63 now. I have told pieces of this story to 2 people in my life, and never the whole of it. I am telling it now because the woman who lay in that bed deserves at least one person to know what those 10 days were, and because I have come to believe that silence, kept long enough, becomes its own kind of lie. To understand the bed, you have to understand the wedding. In the community where I grew up, in a settlement tucked into the low hills of central Pennsylvania, a wedding was less a celebration than a transfer. A daughter was prepared, blessed, and handed a cross. My father had chosen Eli Yoder for me the previous autumn. Eli was 26, the oldest son of a respected family, and the match had been settled in a conversation I was not part of. I met him 3 times before the announcement. He was tall, quiet, and polite in the way that revealed nothing. When I asked my mother whether I might wait a year, she folded a dish towel very precisely and said, "Rebecca, a girl who waits often waits alone." I did not ask again. The wedding itself took place on a Thursday in November. I remember almost nothing of the service. Only the smell of beeswax and the way my hands felt cold inside my sleeves. After the meal, after the long afternoon of relatives and tables, and the careful smiles of women I had known all my life, Eli's mother, Sarah, took my arm at the doorway and said, "You will rest now. There are 9 days until the visiting Sunday, and you must be well by then." I did not yet know that she had just started the clock. That night is the night the title of this story refers to, and I will not dwell in that room longer than necessary. Eli was a stranger to me, and the customs of our household allowed no preparation, no conversation, no questions answered before or after. What I will tell you is this. By the time the candle was out, I had been given a small cup of something warm by Sarah, who waited in the hallway. She called it a tonic for new wives. It tasted of bitter root and something sweeter underneath, like spoiled honey. I drank it because she watched me drink it. I drank it because I had been raised to drink what was given. In the morning, when I tried to rise from the bed, the floor lifted toward me, and I went down on one knee beside the wash basin, and I did not get up again for a very long time. That was day 1. Sarah came in at mid-morning with broth and another cup of the tonic. My forehead was hot and my stomach would hold nothing. She told me I was experiencing what every bride experienced, and that it would pass within a day. She said her own mother had taught her the recipe, and her mother before that. I asked, in a voice that did not sound like mine, whether someone might fetch Dr. Hollister from the town. Sarah set the cup on the nightstand and said, very gently, "We do not call the English for what belongs to us." Then she opened the curtain a hand's width, as if light alone were the medicine, and she went downstairs. Day 2 was the morning I began counting breaths. I had a fever now, real fever, the kind that makes the room dim at the edges. Eli came in once before he went to the barn. He stood at the foot of the bed and looked at me the way a man looks at a horse that may or may not recover, and he said, "Mother says you'll be on your feet by Sunday." I tried to ask him to send a message to my parents. He nodded, as if he had heard me, and he did not. By day 3, the clock in my chest had become louder. 9 days remained until the visiting Sunday, the day on which the new wife was traditionally presented to the relatives who had not attended the wedding. In our community, that Sunday mattered. A bride who could not stand at the door of her new home on visiting Sunday was a bride about whom questions would be asked, and questions, in our world, were a kind of disease all their own. I understood, lying there, that Sarah's clock was not aimed at my recovery. It was aimed at the door. I tried, on day 3, to send for my mother. The youngest girl in the house was Eli's sister Mary, 14, thin and watchful, with hands that always seemed to be holding something she did not want anyone to see. She brought me water in the late afternoon. I asked her, in a whisper because my throat had begun to crack, if she might walk the half-mile to the road and ask the Stoltzfus boy to carry word to my parents' farm. Mary looked at the doorway before she answered. Ma'am said, "No one is to leave the lane until you are well, Rebecca." She said it would worry people. She set the cup down and added, almost too quietly to hear, "I am sorry." Went out. That apology was the first thing in 3 days that did not feel like a lie, and I held on to it the way a drowning person holds onto a board. On day 4, I understood that I was being kept. Not imprisoned, not in chains, nothing that dramatic. I was simply being held inside a story Sarah had decided to tell, and the story required that I be ill in private and well by Sunday. The door to the bedroom was never locked. It did not need to be. The lane was long, and I could not walk to the end of the bed, let alone the end of the lane. My first attempted solution had failed before I lifted my head. That afternoon, the bishop's wife came by the house. I heard her voice in the kitchen below, the small, polite vowels of a woman delivering a casserole. I tried to call out. The sound that came from my throat was the sound a kettle makes before it whistles, low and useless. Sarah told her, I learned later, that I was resting after the excitement of the wedding. The bishop's wife said something kind, and the door closed, and her buggy went back down the lane, and the second person who could have helped me drove away without ever knowing I was upstairs. On day 5, the midpoint of the clock, I made my discovery. Sarah had left the small brown bottle of tonic on the nightstand. She usually carried it with her. Perhaps she was tired. Perhaps she believed me too weak to reach. I was too weak to reach, but I was not too weak to look. The bottle was unlabeled, but beside it, half hidden under a folded cloth, was a slip of paper in Sarah's handwriting. It was a list. 4 names. 4 dates. The earliest one 22 years before mine. Beside each name, a small mark. Beside 2 of the names, a second mark, in different ink, added later. I knew 3 of the names. They were women in our district. Wives. One of them was Eli's Aunt Lydia, who had died, the family said, of a weakness of the lungs 3 years into her marriage. The 4th name was a woman I had never heard of, and the date beside hers was the oldest of all. I understood, holding that paper in my fevered hand, that I had not been given a tonic invented for me. I had been given a recipe that had been given to other brides, in this same house, by this same woman, for more than 2 decades. The marks beside the names were a record. I did not yet know what the second mark meant. I suspected, even then, that it meant something I did not wish to learn. I slid the paper back under the cloth. I closed my eyes before Sarah returned. When she lifted my head and brought the cup to my lips, I let the warm tonic touch my mouth, and then, when she turned to the window, I let it run down the side of my chin, into the collar of my nightgown. It was the first act of resistance of my married life, and it was so small that no one saw it. Day 6 brought false hope. My fever, perhaps because I had not swallowed the morning dose, lowered an inch. I sat up against the headboard. I asked for bread and ate 2 bites. Sarah was pleased. She said, "You see, Rebecca, the body does what is asked of it." She said Sunday was 4 days away, and I would be at the door. She brushed my hair, which had gone slick against my scalp, and she hummed an old hymn I remembered from childhood. For a moment, with her hand on my head, I almost let myself believe that I had misread the paper, that the list was something else, that I was simply a frightened girl in a strange house, and my mother-in-law was only trying, in her hard way, to love me. That afternoon, Eli came in and sat on the edge of the bed for the first time since the wedding. He took my hand. His own hand was rough and warm, and he said, "You frightened us, Rebecca." I almost wept. I almost told him everything. Then he said, "Mother knows what she's doing. She has done this for all of us." And the false hope folded itself up inside me and slid quietly under the quilt, where I could no longer reach it. She has done this for all of us. Not for me, for all of them. On day 7, I understood the second mark. Mary brought me supper. She had been crying, though she had washed her face. I asked her, with as much voice as I had, who Anna Ber was. That was the fourth name, the oldest. Mary went very still. Then she sat down on the floor beside the bed, below the line of the window, where she could not be seen from the lane, and she told me what no one in that house had ever said aloud. Anna Ber had been Sarah's older sister. She had married into this same farm, into this same family, almost 40 years earlier, when Sarah was a girl of 12. Anna had been ill after her wedding night. Anna had not gotten better. The family had not called a doctor. Anna had died on the 11th day. The English authorities had asked questions. The community had closed around the family the way water closes around a stone. Sarah, 12 years old, had watched her sister die in this room, in this bed, under a quilt her mother had finished the week before. "She thinks she is helping," Mary whispered. "She thinks if she gives it earlier, and watches closely, and keeps you here, you will live. She thinks the doctor is what killed Anna. He came on the 10th day. She thinks if no one comes, no one can hurt you." I lay there and stared at the ceiling, and tried to understand what I had just been told. The woman who was, in her own mind, saving me, was the same woman whose ritual was killing me. The tonic was not malice. The locked lane was not malice. The refusal to call Dr. Hollister was, in Sarah's mind, the very heart of her love. She had built her whole life around a wrong lesson learned at 12 years old, and she was applying that lesson to me, with her hands shaking and her jaw set, and she was going to do it, whether I survived or not. The second mark beside two of the names, I realized, meant the woman had lived. The two without a second mark meant she had not. That was day 7. 3 days remained until visiting Sunday. The clock in my chest was very loud now, and I understood, finally, that the deadline was not Sunday at all. The deadline was the 11th day. The deadline was Anna. On day 8, I began to plan. I had almost nothing to plan with. I had a paper I could not show, a sister-in-law who was frightened, a husband who believed his mother, and a body that could not yet carry me to the window. But I had something I had not had before. I had information. I knew what was being done to me and why. And I knew that the woman doing it was not a monster, but a child who had never grown past a single afternoon in November, almost 40 years earlier. That made her, in some ways, more dangerous. A monster can be reasoned with through fear. A frightened child cannot. I asked Mary, that evening, to do one thing. I asked her to take the small brown bottle, when next she was alone in the kitchen, and to pour out half of it and refill it with plain water. She did not answer me at first. She sat on the floor with her hands folded in her lap. Then she nodded once, very small, and went out. I did not know if she would do it. I did not know if she could. I knew only that I had asked, and that the asking itself had been a kind of standing up. On day 9, the plan was compromised. Sarah came in with the morning tonic and stopped in the doorway. She looked at the bottle in her hand and then at me, and something in her face changed. She did not ask. She set the bottle down on the dresser, not the nightstand, and she sat on the edge of the bed. She said, "Rebecca, your color is wrong." Her voice was not angry. It was, for the first time, afraid. She said, "Anna's color was like this on the 9th day." And then she did something I had not expected. She began to cry. Quietly, without sound, the way women in our community cry, with her hands flat on her knees and her face turned slightly away. I understood, watching her, that some part of her had known all along that the recipe did not work, that 2 of the 4 names on that paper had ended without a second mark, that she had been telling herself a story for 40 years, because the alternative was to admit that 12-year-old girl had been helpless, and that her sister had died for nothing, and that the ritual she had built was a tomb she had been placing one bride after another inside. I said, with the small voice I had left, "Sarah, send for my mother, not the doctor, my mother." She looked at me for a long time, then she stood up, and she went out of the room, and I heard her speak to Eli in the hallway, in a voice I could not make out. I heard the back door open. I heard a buggy in the lane for the first time in 9 days, moving outward instead of in. It was not the doctor. I want to be clear about that, because the title of this story is true. No one in that house ever called a doctor. What Sarah did, on the 9th day, was send Eli to fetch my mother. My mother arrived 2 hours later, and my mother, who had raised 7 children and buried 2, took one look at me and walked back down the stairs and out into the yard and untied the Yoder family buggy herself. And she drove it to the end of the lane and to the road and to the telephone at the Stoltzfus farm. And she called Dr. Hollister from the English neighbor's kitchen with her hands shaking and her bonnet askew. She came back up the stairs and sat beside me and held my wrist and said, "Rebecca, I am sorry. I am sorry I gave you to this house." Dr. Hollister arrived on the morning of the 10th day. He was a thin man with kind eyes and a black bag, and he was the first English person to enter that bedroom in the entire history of the Yoder farm. He examined me and asked questions, and looked at the brown bottle on the dresser and asked more questions. And then he gave me an injection and told my mother that another day, perhaps 2, would have been the end. He named what had been in the tonic. I will not name it here, because the naming is not the point. The point is that it was a thing the body cannot tolerate for 10 days, no matter how strong the body, no matter how pure the intention of the hand that pours it. The title of this story is the literal truth of it. I was ill for 10 days after my Amish wedding night. No one in that house would call a doctor. On the 10th day, my own mother broke the rule of the house she had married me into, and she made the call herself, and that is the only reason I am here to tell you this. But the title is not the whole of it. The whole of it is what happened after. I did not stay in that farmhouse. I recovered slowly, over the course of 6 weeks, at my parents' home. Eli came to see me twice. The second time, he asked me to come back. He said his mother was sorry. He said his mother had not understood. I told him, sitting in my mother's kitchen with my hands flat on the table the way Sarah's had been flat on her knees, that I would not return to a house where the love of a woman could not tell itself apart from the death of her sister. He went away, and I did not see him again for many years. I was 19, and I had been married for 10 days, and my community did not know what to do with me. I was not a widow. I was not divorced, which we did not have. I was something the language of our district had no word for. The bishop came to speak with me. He spoke with Sarah. He spoke with my parents. In the end, an arrangement was made. The marriage was set aside. Quietly, without explanation, the way a chair is moved from a room without anyone announcing that the chair has been moved. I lived with my parents until I was 24, and then I married a widower from a settlement 2 counties west. A gentleman named Daniel who already had 3 children, and who never once gave me anything to drink that I had not poured myself. Sarah lived another 18 years. I saw her once, at a funeral, when I was 32. She had grown small. She looked at me across the grave, and her mouth moved, and I did not hear what she said, and I did not walk over to ask. Mary, the sister-in-law who sat on the floor beside my bed and apologized in a whisper, became a midwife in our community, and a good one. She never poured a tonic in her life. She told me, years later, that she had refilled the bottle with water on the 8th day, just as I had asked, and that this was probably the reason I had survived the 9th. I have always believed her. I am telling you this now because I have understood, slowly, over 44 years, that the deadline I was racing was never Sunday. It was never the 11th day. It was the moment when one person in that house was willing to break the rule that no one called a doctor. My mother broke it. Mary broke it, in her small way, with a bottle and a kitchen sink. I broke it by refusing to drink. The rule survived in that farmhouse for another generation after Anna died, and it ended, finally, in a bedroom where a frightened mother-in-law cried on the edge of a bed and saw her sister's color in the face of a girl she had been trying, in her terrible way, to save. I have kept the slip of paper. I took it from under the cloth on the morning my mother carried me down the stairs. 4 names, 2 marks. I added a 3rd mark, beside my own name, years later, in pencil so light you can hardly see it. Not because I think I belong on that list, because I think someone, someday, ought to know that the list ended with a girl who lived, and who told. The clock in my chest is quieter now. It has been quiet for a long time, but I still wake, sometimes, before the light, and I count my breaths in the early dark, and I think of Anna Ber, who was 20 years old in November, of a year before I was born, and whose mother-in-law did not, and whose husband did not, and whose sister was 12 and could only watch. I think of her, and I think of Sarah at 12, and I think of the woman Sarah became, and I understand her without forgiving her, which I have learned is a thing a person is allowed to do. The doctor came on the 10th day, because my mother made him come. No one in that house called him. That is the truth of the title, and the truth beneath the title is this. A house can keep a rule longer than a rule deserves to be kept. And sometimes the only way the rule ends is when one woman, somewhere in the house, finally refuses to swallow what she is given. I refused, and I am still here. And the quilt that was finished the week before my wedding is folded in a cedar chest in my hallway, and I have never once put it on a bed.